I'm going to do some of that now so that you can know what to expect from Southern Hills and hear some of my thoughts about it. But also, the very first part of our time together, we're going to create a separate video of, and I'm going to distribute that around the church later today, through our Facebook page. And hopefully you got a text message this morning about St. Patty's Day and the video. If you did not get a text message, that means we don't have your number. You may not want to get texts from the church, so that's okay. But if you, that's a church number. If you respond to that number, you're not going to get a response because it's a mass text program that we have. So, yeah, just put the church in. So if you're not getting those texts and you want them, stop and give Michelle your number on the way out today so that we can get you in there for that. Patrick, are we good to go? All right. So first off, thanks for coming, especially given the fact that I know there's a lot to be afraid of right now. I want to share some of my thoughts about what you can expect at Southern Hills here as we respond to this pandemic, and also how I believe as followers of Christ we can respond faithfully to this together and be a non-anxious presence in the midst of something that for many people is a very real fear. So you've been, I've no doubt, reading and watching the news, watching the news. You will have heard much of what I'm going to share with you because you're getting your information from the same places, right? So the coronavirus has really taken the nation by storm. Everyone is terrified of this. The NBA is canceling games. The NCAA apparently is not letting anybody other than family into Kansas City for the tournament. All kinds of groups are canceling. Part of New York is on lockdown and the National Guard has been called in. Seattle has banned public assemblies. In fact, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese in Seattle has suspended all public masses for the foreseeable future. So people are responding to this in a way that obviously they think is most appropriate. Part of what concerns me about the virus is that I very obviously do not want to create a circumstance where we are carrying that virus into high-risk populations. From what I have read and from the good conversation I had with Dr. Kyle French, who is a medical doctor here in our congregation 2 days ago, it sounds like the 60-plus population is at higher risk than most others, and that's normally the case with viruses, especially upper respiratory viruses. Particularly, the over 60 population that already has a significant upper respiratory issue. And so from a conversation I had with him and some articles I read from the CDC, it looks like the death rate from the coronavirus is somewhere in the 3.5% range. There are just over 1,200 cases reported in the U.S. as of this morning with 38 deaths. Dr. French was telling me the other night that he expects that that number has been skewed because so many of these early cases have taken root in high-risk communities. So you're going to see a little bit of higher percentage of people dying there. I read in the CDC report that it's likely that there are about 10 times the number of infections that we know about because so many people will not be tested for it, and most people will not show any symptoms. But you know, because you've been reading, that the flu is a much bigger concern for us than the coronavirus is in terms of numbers of people that have been affected. Since the start of the flu season last year alone, CDC estimates somewhere between 34 and 51,000 deaths in the United States, almost 43 million infections worldwide, and we average about 300,000 deaths worldwide from the flu in every flu season of every year. So you're looking at a much more significant threat in the flu virus than we are to the coronavirus. Apparently, from what I've read, the coronavirus is not affecting children in the same way that the influenza virus affects children as well. And so why the panic? Most likely, I think the panic comes from the over-sensationalizing that happens with the real-time media that we're now accustomed to, and the fears associated with that. Is this a real concern? Absolutely it is. So is influenza and any other communicable disease or virus. And so I hope that you have always been taking precautions. I hope you didn't just start washing your hands a week ago. I hope you've always been taking precautions. That's something that we take very seriously, not just here at Southern Hills, but in the United Methodist Church in general. We're always very conscious because flu season is a much bigger deal than what we're seeing so far right now. People will die from the flu every single year. So we're always very conscious about not taking the viruses like that into high-risk populations. And here's what that looks like. You notice that we use hand sanitizer every week, every time we serve communion, and I joke about wondering how much hand sanitizer you're ingesting from doing that. That's simple, right? Anytime that I or one of the ministers here at Southern Hills comes down with symptoms of any kind, we leave the church. We go home and we wait for those to pass, and we let people fill in for us until those things pass. We don't visit people when we are, especially high-risk populations, when we are experiencing symptoms of any kind or have been exposed to people who are experiencing symptoms, because we never want to carry those things into high-risk populations. Now, we will take a few additional steps here at Southern Hills in the near future, mostly to make people feel better and also to prevent as much as possible carrying anything into those high-risk groups. One of those is that right now we are serving communion every Sunday in our 815 chapel experience. I've had a lot of people ask me if I have had thoughts about serving communion differently because they're seeing that on the news. So first, let me explain why you're seeing that on the news. The way that we serve communion at Southern Hills is not the way that every church serves communion. We typically use a method here that is called intinction. Intinction means that we put a piece of bread in your hands, and I explain this every week or every time we have communion. You take that bread, you dip it into grape juice, and place it into your mouth. There are other ways to serve communion. You can serve communion at a kneeling rail with individual cups that are set out and wafers periodically placed on the rail. One of the more common ways to serve communion amongst very high church congregations, very traditional congregations, is to use a method that is called common cup, or another method that is called in-mouth communion. And here's what that looks like. So common cup means that similar to intinction, you would come forward and you would get some bread, right? We would give you that bread. And then you would move to the cup and you would take the cup and you would drink out of the cup, right? And then the person behind you would drink out of the same cup. That is called common cup communion. Now, in-mouth communion works a little bit differently because in addition to the common cup, the minister, officiating priest, would take the bread and place the bread into your mouth, and then place the bread into the mouth of the person right behind you. So congregations that serve communion in one of those two ways or both have been seriously considering revising how they serve communion because of the health risks associated with that. Now, we don't serve communion that way at Southern Hills, and to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not familiar with any United Methodist Church that does use either of those two methods. Probably happens somewhere. So the churches that are revising how they serve communion are moving toward a method like what we do here, where you would get the bread placed in your hand, you would dip it into the cup. However, to belay fears and to make things as safe as possible, even though I think that there are some very real panic-associated concerns that I'll talk about in a moment, we're going to respond to this pandemic by offering communion differently until the threat has subsided. And so when you come in, if you're a part of the 815 service or once a month in the 1045 for the foreseeable future until things die down, we're going to have individually wrapped communion packets available for you when you walk in. There will be a basket at the back of the sanctuary. You'll be able to pick up one of these. This is a little packet. It has some grape juice inside of it. When you tear off the top, you'll actually see in the top that there is a wafer right there. So you'll tear it open, there's a wafer there for you, and there is grape juice in there. When we get to the point of the service where I consecrate the elements, you will have that in your hand, and I will just consecrate the elements from where I am right here. That is not my preferred method of serving communion, and it is not something that will continue once this threat has kind of subsided. But it is, I think, one way we can respond to the very, very real fears that people have right now. Now, there are some other fears that people have that I think may present a more real threat than the scope of what the coronavirus is looking like right now. And that is this. Panic and the fear associated with the sensationalizing, I can never get that word out. It's a good thing I don't speak for a living. Sensationalizing of the coronavirus has resulted in some circumstances that are impacting your lives and the lives of the people you care about. For instance, you know people, you may be among these people, I am, who have lost between a third and a quarter of their portfolio in the last week because of the response of the market to fears that there will be a bad economy because of the coronavirus. As a result of being afraid that the economy will tank, we have caused the economy to tank. And so there are people you know, you may be among them, who are dealing with some very real financial losses. For some younger people, there's time to bounce back, but for those who are considering retirement or are in retirement, that's a very real change. There will be people you know who are considering retirement and now are not sure that they will be able to do that as a result of some of this. In addition to that, there are a number of industries that are already experiencing a decline in patronage, which means that people are not going out to do things because they're afraid. When people don't go out to do things, they don't spend money at the places that employ people. And when they don't spend money at the places that employ people, those places are no longer able to employ people. I listened to a couple of news reports on some of my favorite talk radio stations this morning, and companies here in the U.S., one in Florida, one in Seattle. They highlighted two different groups that are in the recreation industry and have already experienced a 70% decline in revenue as a result of people not participating and things being canceled. So that's a real thing for us because that trickles down through the economy as well. So what can we do? As Christians, followers of Christ, what can we do? Here at Southern Hills, as I mentioned, we're going to take some precautions. Are we going to cancel services? No, not unless we're told by law that we have to do that. So what will we do? Well, I'm going to leave some things up to you. If you are comfortable coming and worshiping here, I hope that you will. I am not a medical professional, but if what I'm reading on the CDC's website is true and the number of infections are about 10 times higher than we know about, and most people are not experiencing symptoms or experiencing very mild symptoms, that means that if you're going to get the coronavirus, you're likely to get it from someone that you don't know has it, who's not experiencing significant symptoms. So if you feel like you need to stay home and quarantine yourself, I fully support what you feel like you need to do. I hope you'll continue to worship with us. We have a virtual campus option available for that very reason, and a number of our members already take advantage of that when they're sick or when they're traveling, or those who don't live here and participate every single week in our worship services. So that option is available to you. We have already received a ruling from our bishop about whether or not the officiating minister can consecrate elements while you are watching. It's a weird thing that the church has never had to deal with before. But if you want to participate in communion, you can do that real time. We cannot do that through a recorded service, but if you are watching live as we're doing that live and you have bread and grape juice at home, I can consecrate those elements here because you are a part of us just at a greater distance. That's the ruling of our bishop about that. So there are ways for you to participate. I support whatever you feel like you need to do. We're going to take the best steps that we can take here to not only maintain community and care for our members, but also be as safe as we can possibly be, and do the best we can, not only to make sure that we're doing as much as possible to limit taking any contagion into a high-risk population, but we also, friends, want to be ministering to our friends and family who are sick, who are afraid that they might get sick, and who are dealing with some of the very real economic fallout of the panic and the fear that's set in as a result of this. We'll be ministering in as best a way we can. As Christians, I think we can be a non-anxious presence. I think we can faithfully care about the people that are a part of our lives, but also be a non-anxious presence. Just a couple of weeks ago, I told you all the story about John Wesley, who was on a boat during a crossing of the Atlantic. He had failed miserably in his mission in the United States. He had already failed in England. He was very depressed and dejected, but he's on this boat when a great storm pops up. A week ago, I was preaching about transitions, major life transitions, and how some of those appear before us and we just don't see them coming, right? He had a storm blow up while he was on this boat. I cannot imagine what it must be like to weather a storm at sea, especially on the kinds of ships that they were on back then. It must have been overwhelmingly terrifying. He was. In the midst of that, everyone is panicking, right? Because he is confronted with the very real possibility of his death. Apparently, it was a bad enough storm that they just really didn't expect to survive. So he is terrified not only that he's going to die, but also he begins to realize that he's not entirely sure about the assurance of his own salvation when he does die. In spite of everything he's been teaching and professing, he realized essentially that his faith was hollow. He looks over and he sees on the deck this other group of Christians. I believe they were Moravians, which is a group you're probably not familiar with. They're circled up, praying and singing hymns calmly in the midst of this great storm on the deck of the ship. Their praying and singing begins to calm the fears of the other people on the ship, including Wesley, whose fears begin to be calm. And he would write later in his journal that watching them pray and sing made him realize that he did not hold the faith that he wanted to hold. In fact, much of what came of Methodism later is a result of his realization on that boat on that day. So obviously, nothing happened. They were terrified because they were facing what they felt like was a very real threat. But they survived that very real threat. And in the midst of that, it was not John Wesley, the Anglican priest, who was a non-anxious presence calming the fears of the other people who were also facing a very real threat. It was that group of Moravians who held fast to the truth that they knew, not just proclaimed, but the truth that they lived out and knew. I think as Christians, followers of Christ, we have an opportunity to account of ourselves well in the midst of this by remembering the truths that we hold, that we are loved by God, that if and when God intervenes, it is the most loving thing God can do. When God does not intervene, it is the most loving thing God can do. And that we will die, and on the day that we die, we will be in eternity with God and Christ forever, and we have that assurance. I think that gives us an opportunity to be a non-anxious presence that can calm the fears of other people, because people you love will die. People you love will die from illness and disease and old age and all kinds of other things. I think we can minister to those people who are afraid in the midst of their fear by being a non-anxious presence. So I'm going to be upholding you in prayer. We'll be here at Southern Hills helping and ministering in the best ways we can and in the most conscientious ways that we can. But as always, if you need anything, don't hesitate to contact us. All right, Patrick, if you would, go ahead and bring that to a close, and we'll get started with the